Welcome back to the Pilot's Lounge. On today's episode, we are joined by Lindsey Chrismon, a former Apache as well as Attack Little Bird pilot who is now currently a master's or MBA candidate at Harvard University. We're going to dive into her story a little bit today and a lot more. Lindsey, welcome.
Thank you. I really appreciate both of you guys having me here today. I'm excited to, dive into my story, my background, and everything, and get to know you both a little bit better too.
Awesome. And unfortunately, the team over at MD couldn't join us today. However, something that's really cool that we're doing before we dive into our next segment, which we'll get to, which is it's table talk, not the normal kind of table talk. But they couldn't join us today. But something that is super cool that we are doing in conjunction with both this episode and with MD is kind of a commemorative apparel product that all profits are going to be going to the Brotallion Blue Skies Foundation. So that will actually go live when this episode goes live. So if you're listening to this, it is over on the website at www.thebrotallionblueskiesfoundation.org. You can also Google it. It will come up. Really awesome design commemorating the history of the Little Bird or Cayuse platform from where it is been to where it is now. So that's super cool. But before we dive into more of your story, Lindsey, we like to do something here. If you've listened to any of our other episodes, which we're not going to shame you if you haven't, we do something called table talk. We know you're familiar with what that is in the Army, and it is not quite the same thing here. It's really just us throwing off the wall questions just to get everybody comfortable and some creativity going. Spencer, do you have one, or do you want me to roll with my first one? Cool. I'll go with it. Of all the places, looking at your Instagram, you seem to be well-traveled. You seem to have had a lot of different hobbies and interests throughout your adult life, and I'm sure childhood. But of all the places you've traveled in the world, what is your favorite place that you have been to and why?
That's a good question. I'd have to say, honestly, the most recent place where I've been has definitely made the most impact on my life. So one of the culminating classes your first year at Harvard Business School is every student gets assigned a country outside of the US, obviously, and then you're embedded in a company within that country. So I had the opportunity to go to Rwanda for 10 days, and I was embedded with a company called VW Move in Rwanda, which is essentially the Uber of Rwanda. And I'd have to say that I think Rwanda was one of the most unique places I've ever been to because of the history of the country, and I can get a little bit into that. But I also got reunited with one of my best friends from West Point. His name is Abia. We call him Abia. He was on the rugby team. He was best friends with my husband, and I haven't seen him in over 10 years or so. And he grew up in Kigali in Rwanda, went to West Point, obviously. So, we became friends over the 4 years there. And then after that, he went back to Rwanda, and I hadn't seen him since. So I felt like it was a very cool experience to be able to go to his home country and get reunited with him. And the coolest part is he's exactly the same. Like, we drank beers and joked about the same stuff we talked about at West Point, and it was phenomenal. So that was one of the reasons why going to Rwanda was incredible. And then the other is the history of that country is absolutely incredible. So 30 years ago, in 1994, they had the Rwandan genocide, which probably a lot of people don't actually know too much about because it's just not something that we study here, like in the U.S. in our history classes or anything. But essentially, what the really overarching story is they had two different types of ethnic groups, and one ethnic group was trying to take over the country in layman's terms and started to had a mass genocide of the other. It was the Hutus and the Tutsis, and millions and millions of people were killed, murdered, slaughtered. It was very gruesome, very violent. There were babies that were slammed against trees until they were died. They had, macheted to death in their mother's arms. And then the mothers were, taken off to the side and then raped and then killed in front of their husbands. It was just absolutely horrendous. And this was 30 years ago, we were alive and this was happening in the world. And it's insane to see where that country is today. We were walking down the streets and every single Rwandan, they don't have any divide. There's no like racism or anything like that. They love each other, and there is so much patriotism in that country. It was incredible. Even though 30 years ago they had neighbors killing neighbors, today the neighbors are shaking each other's hands. They're, helping them out with chores, whatever it is, renting them their vehicles. It's just incredible to see the change that can occur amongst human beings in the course of 30 years, when 30 years ago they were literally slaughtering each other. The country it was incredible, and it's absolutely beautiful too. We got to do a safari and see all the animals and everything. It was very, you kind of forget that you're in Rwanda seeing like a live elephant, and not that you're like in Disney World or at the Bronx Zoo or something. I don't know, like that experience too in itself was incredible. But the whole thing, that country, absolutely every single human being on this planet should visit Rwanda at some point in their life, learn about the history, and see just how incredible the people are.
That's awesome. It's Rwanda's on, it is actually on my bucket list of places to visit. And for people who maybe don't know a lot about the history, but want not an easy watch, but something short to watch, go look
Hotel
up the movie
Rwanda.
Hotel Rwanda. And it
Yep.
gives a pretty, it is a Hollywood look at it, but it still depicts, I think, relatively accurately what that country was going through at the time. So, Spencer,
that was probably
crazy.
one of the best table talk answers we've had to date. And this is a perfect segue for a question that I like to ask a lot, because you're well traveled and you've mentioned enjoying a frosty beverage or two with your friends. Anywhere in the world that you've been to, what is one of your favorite watering holes?
Okay, so I think out of the entire world, the best place to go is, I would say, Saint, like the U.S.
You can give a couple.
Sorry,
if
I'm
you
trying to
want
think of like
to.
where's
Yeah,
like the most fun I've had drinking. There's literally every place I go, I drink at. So like I have a lot of stories for sure. But I think the best thing that comes to mind is USVI, so U.S. Virgin Islands. I got married down in St. Thomas and then honeymooned in St. John. And they have this one drink. It's called the painkiller. It really does kill all of your pain. You feel nothing after you drink at least 2 of them, whatever it is. No, sunburn doesn't exist. Like, you just sit out in the sun. The water is absolutely perfect, crystal clear. You swim with sea turtles and you're drinking painkillers. It literally doesn't get any better than that.
What was the name of the place again down in the Virgin Islands?
So you fly into St. Thomas, and then you take a little ferry over to St. John. And St. John is a place with all like phenomenal beaches. Literally the best beaches I've ever been to.
that's a little bit unique, because usually someone has like a dive bar, but I'll be honest, having that cocktail just anywhere in the, on that and on a specific island that would suffice perfectly as an answer. So actually Spencer's question leads into mine a little bit, still in the realm of drinking, but a little bit more serious. If you could share a drink or a beer, drink, whatever, with anyone dead or alive throughout history, who would that be?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think it would be hard to nail it down to one. So I'm going to say 2. One would be my grandma. I know it's kind of like a corny answer, I guess, but she passed away when I was a sophomore in high school, so I never got to have a drink with her. But that woman, I'm telling you, is one of the most inspiring people that I've ever met. My tattoos she wrote a book called A Little Bird Told Me, and then when I became the first female Little Bird pilot, I got the Little Bird tattoos on me. Like everything basically in my life, I feel like I can attribute to her. So I would love to have a drink with her and get to know her a little bit better than just like my childhood self. And then the other person, I guess, which is like a more fun answer, would I think for sure be Abraham Lincoln. Nice. Being able to sit down with Abraham Lincoln, like what? That would be the coolest thing ever. I want to know exactly like just everything about his life. Would have so many questions. Having a drink with Abraham Lincoln would be incredible.
The question I think that I would probably have for Abraham Lincoln is, one, where was he actually born? Because there's 3 different states that in this like Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana area that all claim like Lincoln's birthplace, Lincoln's boyhood home. Like, where were you actually at? I don't think anybody really knows. We all claim it.
I know there's so many mysteries.
Right. Spencer, do you have any others?
Yeah.
Nope.
Okay, well, we'll kind of move on. You know, you've mentioned a few things that kind of allude to a little bit more about your background and kind of where you came from. But if you don't mind even winding it back a little bit further before West Point and talk about, what drove you to want to pursue the military, what drove you to want to even apply to West Point and go that route. And then, we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah. I think I have a relatively unique story when it comes to like my background and why did I decide to go to West Point, and why aviation in general. So kind of going back to like our nation's history and wondering about Abraham Lincoln, my dad, and my mom, but mostly my dad, was just very enthralled by the history of the U.S. If we were driving down the highway and you saw, the burial place of Stonewall Jackson, you better believe we're pulling over and we're going to read every single word of that plaque and learn as much as we possibly can. He absolutely loves our nation's history. So I grew up in New Jersey. So it was only about an hour away from West Point. So of course, what are we to do when we're young kids is to take a picnic, a day trip up to West Point. So I was, I'd say, 11 years old at the time, and we took that day trip up to West Point, and I swear from that moment on, I was just absolutely in love with that school. I told my parents at that point, this is where I want to go. They're like, really? Well, that's what you want to do? Like, that wasn't the point of the trip. The point of the trip was to just like see Trophy Point and like learn about, the chain that ran across the river and just to see the cadets. We did not think that that would be of any interest to you because I have no military background in my family. I mean, my grandpa served for like a short stint, like very small military background. And my mom's pharmacist, my dad owned a business and then was a fifth grade teacher. So it just really wasn't in the blood there. And so ever since that point, I was like, West Point is exactly what I want to do and where I want to be. So much to the point where West Point was actually the only school I applied to when I was in like applying to colleges. I had gone and like looked at a couple other campuses, but nothing like took my like stole my heart, I guess, essentially, like on a college campus as West Point did. And yeah, it was I put all my eggs into one basket, and I mean, it did luckily work out. I got recruited for track, so that helped for sure. But I mean, I worked my entire middle school and high school career just to make sure that I had the grades and the leadership and the physical component that was required to get in, that everything was kind of set as perfectly as possible, because that was my goal. I had worked for years in order to get into West Point. And, like, I didn't apply to the Naval Academy, I didn't apply to the Air Force Academy. It was just West Point. It's just where I wanted to be. So I think it's kind of a unique story in that aspect, where it was just the only thing I've literally ever wanted to do.
No, that's awesome. And it honestly kind of reminds me a little bit. This is going to sound super corny and not to compare the stories themselves, but it reminds me of of Rudy, the movie Rudy. Like, the dude grew up right around Notre Dame. Is like, that's what I want to do. And all that's, just,
Yep.
that's awesome.
First of all, that's not corny. That's one of my favorite movies of all time. I watch that quite frequently when I need to be remotivated on life or whatever it might be. So anybody hating on Rudy, let's step outside and have a chat.
No, that's fair. So
hey,
go
Nick,
ahead.
I want to interrupt you real quick. I'm sorry. Lindsey, before we continue on, what events did you run in track?
Yeah. So in high school, I competed in the Junior Olympics for the pentathlon and then the heptathlon. I got really lucky because I was able to get a personal trainer and everything. It's not an event that I was able to compete for my high school. I had to basically be like an individual athlete and go and compete in those events. And that kind of set me up to be able to compete in both the heptathlon and the pentathlon while I was at West Point. So those were like my primary events: heptathlon, 100-meter hurdles, high jump, long jump, shot put, 800, 200, javelin. I also, on occasion, competed in like the 400-meter relay, 400-meter hurdles. But I would say the multi-event was definitely my primary event.
Awesome. Did you run all 4 years at the academy?
I did.
Okay.
Yep, I ran all 4 years. I was a captain of the track team my senior year.
Cool. Thank you.
That's awesome. I feel, yeah, that's a whole rabbit hole I could dive down, because I can't imagine like training to be good at not just one sport. That is, or like one thing. You throw in a lot of different, especially things like javelin, where I feel like there's so much technical proficiency. that I feel like that'd be very difficult. So kudos to you for going down that
Yeah.
route for
A lot
sure.
of a lot of people say you do multi-event if you're not really good at any one event. So I'll just claim that, but
I think that
it
might
was
be true
fun
to a certain
overall.
level. I feel like when you get to a certain level, they're all world class in all of them to like, but so while you're at West Point, was there something specifically that triggered a desire to go, into aviation specifically, or is it something that you kind of explored different options when you were there? Did you know you wanted to do that? What kind of led you down the path that eventually wound you up at Fort Rucker or now Noviso?
Yeah, I think probably the number one thing that I can specifically remember that really drew me to aviation was branch week. So it's like one of the weeks. I think it's like in October or November. It's every single year, and what they do is they bring in all different units and like pieces of equipment to West Point so that the cadets can explore all the different branches. And they flew an Apache helicopter right in the dead center of the plane, and I was like, "Holy shit! That is the coolest thing ever. If there's one thing I could do in my life is fly that helicopter, that's exactly what I want to do." So I was a freshman. I mean, I had only been there for a couple of months, and that was that like one moment I was like walking, like along Ike Barracks, and I saw this thing come in, and I was like, holy shit, that is a beast of an airframe. So that really drew me to that. Just it was like the cool aspect of it, honestly. I didn't really know too much about aviation before that, so it was from that point on where I kind of started to do my research, started to talk to the aviation officers, figure out how the career path looked, what does it even mean to be a platoon leader for an aviation company or troop, and then what are some of the options like the 160th following your typical conventional aviation career. So yeah, I did a little bit of just background studies on the aviation branch in general, and found that it was for sure something that I wanted to do. The thing I really liked about aviation in particular was that it's combat arms. Because I did really want to be in the fight. I didn't want to, nothing like taking away from all the other branches because everything is obviously very important in the Army, but I really wanted to be as close to the fight as possible. As a 2014 West Point grad, women were not allowed in infantry or any of the other, like manly combat arms type of roles, which they are now. And but when I was there, we weren't. So aviation, especially flying attack airframe, was the one way I felt like I could contribute the most in that regard, and that really meant a lot to me. I really wanted to like lead those types of soldiers. I really wanted to be in the fight. I really wanted to be able to talk to the ground force commander, overhead, and actually, affect change on the battlefield. That was very, very attractive to me. So yeah, the Apache was. It kind of goes back to like that same like thing that happened when I was 11 going into West Point. It's just like I just kind of sometimes feel like God just like talks to me and says like this is what you're going to do. And then from like that early on, I just kind of gauge all of my efforts towards that one thing. Because as you mentioned in the introduction, yes, I did fly the Apache. So like 4 years later, actually like 5 years later, really, I find myself in flight school, like, in that cockpit. And I was like, this is my dream. Okay, now what's next?
That's awesome. And I think that, I think that those particular moments happen for all of us. So many people that come on, myself included, a lot of us grew up around aviation, and it's something that we were kind of almost in a sense bred into, we were always around it, but then there might be those specific moments that like trigger that spark of like, this is what I'm going to do, and everything, nothing else matters. This is the path. So kind of going
Yeah.
forward, you obviously went to Fort Rucker. We all know what flight school is. We've talked about it on here ad nauseum. Moving out of flight school, obviously you're an Apache pilot at this point. You're going to your first duty station. This was what, probably 2016 ish, 17 ish by
Mm-hmm.
that point. What was the
Yeah,
culture like?
2016.
Yeah, 16. So what was that culture like for you going to your first unit? Especially with, kind of having the background from West Point and all these strong leadership roles. I say that specifically as it's understand that's coming from a warrant officer that has been on the other side of experiencing a very, very motivated, high performing lieutenant, sometimes a West Point grad that's come into that unit. And
Yeah.
it's not a bad thing. Sometimes it's a little shocking. You're just like, holy shit, this is a lot. But I'm curious to know your experience of what that was like from the other side, especially being a woman coming into that role, because I think that that's also a whole different aspect.
Yeah, for sure. It is a really, really challenging thing, right? Because I mean, just to like answer like the first part of the question is, I mean, the warrants are there. They've been there, for like what, five, some of them like 5, 10 years in
Forever.
that same unit, that same place. Yeah. So like us, like fresh, brand new lieutenants straight out of flight school are just like, I'm going to come in and change the world. And it doesn't happen like that. Like you can come in with the best attitude as possible, but sometimes it's better to just take a step back and listen instead of trying to voice your opinion and change things, because that's just kind of gonna dig yourself into that hole that you're not gonna be able to get yourself out of at that point. You have a very, very small window to impress people, and speaking sometimes is not the way to do that. But yeah, it was difficult for sure coming out of flight school, and even like, so at West Point too, I was the first captain for my class. So like there was a lot of like opportunity for like leadership experiences, but it was mostly peer leadership. And I would argue that I probably learned a lot during that my senior year as like with peer leadership, that I was able to take with me to my first unit. Not that saying like warrants are peers just because there is like some sort of like age difference usually. But I think like that mentality of like as like they are your peers and like treating them exactly as your peers did bode well in that regard. I think sometimes lieutenants can come in and just have like a misconception of like the role of a platoon leader, interacting with the warrants. Even when you have like your standardization pilot or your like lead IP, I would flight lead is like what comes to mind, but like in like the Apache unit, that they sometimes will think like, well, I have a better solution for this, and the IP is like, shut up. Like you obviously have no idea what's going on. Just sit back and make the flight schedule, and get it approved by the battalion commander. Thank you. Shut up. But yeah, so it was a bit of a learning experience in that regard. But I think for me, I was so lucky when I got to my first unit, because I was there for like with my first unit for about like 2 months or so, and I had my first commander, but he was changing out. The next commander that stepped in, Alex Sharkey, I'll call him out because that man was phenomenal. Taught me so much about leadership and how to like actually be there for people and care for people, as opposed to caring about the way that you look or getting boxes checked and you making sure that they're all green. And I just felt so lucky because I had him as a role model for basically, I would consider him my first commander. There were a lot of instances where he would pull me aside and he would tell me certain things, like for example, one of his like top 3 leadership lessons, and like things that like a leader should always be doing, which I actually now use on a daily basis, is be a good dude, figure it the fuck out, and buy a pair of cleats. And those 3 things, I swear, have just like, I've constantly been using them throughout my life, like not just like my military career, but like in business school, started a company, as the values of our company. They're just like real values that make people just good human beings. So those 3 things for sure. And then
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I couldn't resonate.
yeah, no.
I could not resonate more with the "be a good dude" quote.
Yeah.
And I also love the fact that you use a dude being genderless as a term.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity
Yeah.
to talk to some folks a couple of weeks ago, and that was number one thing on the list as well. And it's like, it seems so simple, but I feel like it's a concept that's so often overlooked. And if you can just be a good dude / dudette, whatever you want to call it, it's like 51% of
Yeah.
what you need to accomplish. Just driving that
100%.
point home. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and then figure it out. I mean, you don't have to always go to your IP or to your company commander or even like to your platoon leader to get information on something. Like sometimes you just have to like take the problem as you have it, the information that you have, and just solve it and just do with what resources you have. And then buy a pair of cleats. Like he always used to say, you wouldn't show up to Wendy's wearing a Burger King hat, so buy a pair of cleats and like basically step on the field. Like be a team player, have that motivation, show up for your guys. Like just like those 3 things. I don't know. Like it just changed my mindset on what it meant to actually be in an organization that cares about people. And it just really helped me like understand, I guess, how to be a good leader in those instances. Another thing too, just like for like the future aviators out there that are just getting to their first units, one of the things that he always instilled in me, and I was never a commander. I got out before I ever did command time, and I think it would be one of the things that I would have pushed so hard for my platoon leaders is get on the flight schedule. Just fly as much as you possibly can. There's so many times when new platoon leaders get so intimidated by like building PowerPoint slides or whatever it is, like building the training schedule and like doing all of this like work behind a desk, and they're not getting out. They're not getting behind, getting behind the cockpit. They're not, actually flying in challenging situations. If they're flying Apaches, they're never flying NVGs. Like there's just so many things that you can do to better yourself as an actual aviator that a lot of commanders and a lot of people in aviation don't push people to do. So that was one thing that he pushed for me to do. And it's one of the reasons why I was able to get to the 160th. I assessed as a lieutenant still, which is, pretty young, but it was only because he pushed me to get on that flight schedule. So going back to like the original question, felt like I was just really lucky, honestly. The culture of the unit was fun. Honestly, we were the Ruthless Riders. We were 3-6 Cav. I was down at Fort Bliss, and it was wild. I loved it. We did like some weird shit too. Like we had our spur ride, and I don't know if like I'm allowed to say any of this stuff, but we like had to drink this mixture of it could have been piss and spit, and like I don't even know what was in this stuff. Like it was like ketchup and like literally the most foul stuff I've ever tasted in my life. But it was like, if you don't drink this, then you guys might have to cut this out. But if you don't drink this, then you're not getting your spurs. And I was like, hell yeah, I love this. This is exactly what I want to do.
You know what's hilarious,
So
and this is totally off topic. We literally just did a store update for Charlie Troop 3-6 Cav, the Ruthless Riders, like
that's
less than 2 weeks ago. I just pulled it up. I'm like, sounds really familiar. We just did it. No worries, guys. She wasn't under an NDA when that happened, so you're all good.
yeah. No, it made all of us better. No one, there were no issues. It's phenomenal. Like, I know we can't really do that type of stuff anymore. It's a little bit too protective and whatnot, but like, I don't know, that was good. That built like our, like 3-6 Cav we were a family. I loved it. Like I was so proud to be in that unit.
That's awesome. I don't think that I could be in that unit without referring to it as 3-6 Mafia.
Yeah.
That's immediately what comes to mind every time I see it. But, kind of looking at that pathway, right? So you come in, you're still a lieutenant when you assess. Presumably you were a PC at that time. I know they kind of went back and forth with assessment guidelines on before or after you made PC, it was hour dependent, so on and so forth. So you go to assess. We're not going to dive into the ins and outs of assessment. There's tons of information out there for the people who want to, go that route. There's people who will share what they can share about assessment, and there's plenty of gouge out there. However, what we can talk about is an overarching experience of assessment and what that was like for you as a female, especially wanting to assess for something that there weren't really a lot of females over in regiment at that time. So kind of what was that like for you? Did you feel as though you went in, not with a chip on your shoulder? That's not what I'm getting at. Like there was a little bit more required of you, kind of what was that experience like for you just emotionally and mentally going in?
Yeah. Well, every time I go into something along those lines, I'm always very timid. I always feel incredibly like underqualified. I don't feel like I deserve it. Like my imposter syndrome is absolutely through the roof, which I think almost helped me in the assessment for the 160th because I was coming in like already so humbled. Just like being on the compound itself was just like an incredible experience in general. The things that like stick out to me that I particularly remember, one, I prepped for that assessment for sure. I was a pilot in command. I was an air mission commander. I want to say about 500 hours or so flying the 624. I had like maybe 25 goggle hours. Absolutely horrendous. If anyone wants to assess for little birds, just fly goggles. Just don't put the eyepiece on. It makes a difference. I struggled with the night flight for sure, just because I was just not confident under goggles. But going into the assessment itself, like I had studied, I had prepared, I had practiced like building maps like we used to do in, I think it was BWS in flight school is what we called it. So I had gone back through all my notes and everything. And my mindset throughout the entire thing was simply do not quit. No matter what it was, I just was not going to quit. Like I would have them tell me like, you have to stop now before I quit doing any task. Like, for example, the swim test. I had no idea that there was like an underwater swim portion of the test. And so I'm just like, all right, here we go. I'm drowning in this pool. Like the last thing that they'll do is just pull my limp body out of this pool because I'm not coming up until I swim the furthest anyone has ever swam in this pool. So like I'm go in, obviously I miss kicking off the wall and I just don't come up until they tap me on the head. And I don't even know, honestly, I think I don't even know how far I got. I obviously reached one end and was headed towards back, coming back towards the other end. But I think they saw it's like, oh, she's not coming up. Like, like when you hold your breath for a really long time, you start going like your body's just like wincing for some sort of oxygen. I was definitely floundering under the water doing that. And then actually, I probably couldn't tell that story because it kind of gives a little bit of details. But one thing that also really helped me when I was going for like the Little Bird specific flight, someone came out to the parking lot and I didn't even know who this person was. And they were like, just lift the ammo can. That's all they said. And then walked away. Like, just lift the ammo can. And I was like, what does that even mean? And that like came back. Obviously I had to lift the ammo can. And I was like, that was just like running through my head as I was like doing all these like physical tasks. And like, just that little piece of advice bled into all of the other tasks that I had to do. So it wasn't, just lift the ammo can. It was like, just do X, Y, and Z. Just get through this, And that was like one piece of advice that I was like, hell yeah, okay, I can do this. I'm just not going to quit at any of these things. And, I probably had one of the worst assessments. I would assume, in my mind, it was absolutely horrendous. I was incredibly embarrassed by everything that I did that entire week. I thought going into the board, I was like, oh, they're gonna laugh me out of this boardroom, and then I'm gonna go back to my unit, which is fine. I love 3-6 Cav. I love flying the Apaches, but I was like, yeah, maybe I should have waited a couple years to assess. I just did not think in any capacity that they were going to say, welcome to the team. So when they did, I was obviously very, very excited. But I did go into that board with the highest amount of doubt that I think anyone could possibly have at that point. I mean, I had convinced myself that there was no way that I was going to be accepted into the 160th. So, it obviously turned out in my favor. But the entire experience, that entire week, was brutal. It was just long and no sleep.
So just to clarify, so when you went to assessment, were you assessing specifically for the AH-6? Was that kind
Yes.
of, yeah. Okay. I know some people are different in what they're assessing for. Some are like, oh, whatever needs of the regiment. And I'm like, if I want to fly, I want to fly whatever I can. But kind of going, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, just like I had needs of the regiment as like my first option, but like then they actually ask you what you really want to fly. And because I did the Little Bird, I did the AH-6 assessment, like I assessed with the company. But I think that there was also a lot of, I don't want to say extra pressure on me because I was a female, but there were a lot of extra eyes. That's for sure. Like when I was doing some of like the physical tasks, like in the hangar with the aircraft, I think the entire company was out there watching. But like, I mean, once I was in the company and there were other people that were assessing, I didn't go out and watch them do these things. You know what I mean? Like there were definitely, there was a bit of pressure in that regard, but for me, it kind of just like fueled my fire a little bit. I was just like, well, now I for sure I'm going to try not to embarrass myself in front of all these, incredibly impressive people. Um, yeah, so there was that aspect. It's just kind of going back to like the female aspect of your first question.
Right. And, did you feel like there were barriers up front to even be allowed as a female to assess? Not to say allowed, but obviously at that time, the military as a whole, there were a lot of transitions going on between Ranger School and the infantry world and all of that. Did you feel as though they kind of were like, oh well, everybody else is embracing this transition, let's give it a go? Or did what was that process like for you? Did you feel like you had to wait, or was there any differences in that, just with the time frame?
So I wasn't the first ever female little bird pilot. I was the first AH-6 female
Right.
pilot. So there's that difference there. So like I did know that it was possible for a woman to favorably assess to fly the little bird in general. Now the fact that the AH-6 community obviously has a much different mission set than the MH-6 community does, that was very intimidating. My battalion commander in 3-6, when I was going through the assessment, had actually been in BCO. So he had flown the AH-6 before. So he understood everything that I was trying to get myself into at that point. And he had like a serious sit down talk with me and said, Linz, I don't think this is what you want to do. Like he didn't discourage me from doing it. He didn't tell me that I couldn't do it in any capacity, but there was definitely like he tried to basically level my head a little bit and say like, this isn't it looks cool, it sounds really cool, but like it's really hard. It's not an easy community to be a part of. And I mean, I took what he said to heart. Obviously, I still did it, but he wasn't wrong. That's for sure. Yeah, I knew that it wasn't impossible. I like I said before, I did not think that I was going to get it. I thought if I had been accepted into the regiment, I would have become a 47 pilot, and not been able to stay in the attack platform. But I mean, other women had assessed before me. Obviously, they too had not made it, and I was uncertain at the time as to why they hadn't gotten picked. Now I have a little bit more insight into the community, into the individuals who are conducting the assessments. Sitting in on assessments myself. So I have a little bit now more understanding of like what they're truly looking for in an assessee. So I'm not really sure exactly like what those other women were missing and, like what I brought to the table that others hadn't. But yeah, I mean, the entire time I never thought that it was possible. I kind of just wanted to do it and to try it, like I don't know, like what kind of attack pilot would I be if I didn't try to fly the most challenging attack platform essentially on the planet. So, yeah, I just kind of wanted to once again put my eggs into that one basket, see where it came out. Yeah.
To kind of, this is going to be a brief aside, really, just to give our listeners a little bit of background on the Little Bird, because I know even inside the military community, I think a lot of people get confused, and we have a lot of people who listen in that are maybe some of them are history buffs that aren't in the military. Some of them just, like things about military aviation or maybe want to. And backing it up all the way to the 1960s, the Army introduced the Hughes OH-6 light observation platform known as the Cayuse, which was pretty much the first iteration of what is now the Little Bird. Eventually, Hughes became McDonnell Douglas, and McDonnell Douglas became MD Helicopters, which is what is out today in conjunction with Boeing. Now, as the Cayuse was, put into service as that light observation platform, or LOH, the nickname Loach came about. And so you'll often hear the Little Birds referred to as Loach, especially if you're a pilot at Fort Campbell, you hear Loach all the time, but you'll hear Loach, Cayuse, Little Bird, Killer Egg, all the different nicknames that kind of play into the same aircraft. However, the airframe that they were flying in 1960 is very different from the variant that is flown today. It's obviously gone through a lot of different upgrades and changes throughout the time. I don't know what the current one is. We don't have to dive into specifically the current one used, but the most recent models were around the MD 530 platform in the last 20 years, to be used not only by the special operations side of the Army, which is the only place in the United States Army that still uses the platform, but outside of that, in the public safety law enforcement realm, pretty much worldwide. Um, but now that we got that out of the way, backing up a little bit to, you've come into this special operations community, and while obviously I was not over on that side of the road, um, there's a lot of back and forth both with commanders and with people, and something that
Mhm.
stands out regardless of whether you're there or not in the entire Fort Campbell community is the history of what regiment is, the history of the companies, and that pretty much, I mean, if you're friends with any of them on Facebook, then, or especially the older guys who were there in the 90s and early 2000s, you'll see, and it's storied history remembered over and over again every year. And each specific community, has those people that stand out and that history that carries forward. How, for you, especially, in that attack community, which is arguably not highest strung, but one of the harder communities to get into and exist in, arguably highest strung as well. There's a lot of rumors. I wasn't there, but there's a lot of rumors of there is no room for failure, period. What was that like for you coming in and with just this massive amount of history that exists, with BCO?
Yeah. Um, I think high strung is probably a good a good way to put it. We're all, the thing is like we're all high strung. A lot, like, I mean, it's not even just BCO in general. Like 160th pilots, like everyone is the most professional like pilots and aviators on the planet, but also just like the coolest people. It's like a weird mix. Like everyone's really good at turning it on and turning it off, which I think is phenomenal. But like coming into the unit, it's, I don't want to say it's intimidating, but it's very humbling. It's a very like, I don't know, how do you describe it? Sombering type of experience when you go into these hangars and they have these names on them. Owens Hangar, all of them have brown compound, and you just continuously every single day you walk through that red door, for BCO, back and forth, back and forth. On the walls there's all these pictures of all these pilots that have fought in all these wars, and you don't really take necessarily the time to appreciate who they are and what they've done and the legacy that they've left, because you're working so hard every single day, and you have your mindset on whatever it is that day, even if it's just going out to range 29 and you have to do the range brief. There's certain things that clog your vision, and you don't necessarily pay attention to the history of what this place actually means. And we have, for every death that occurs in the 160th, we have a day to remember them. And it's those days when we put our berets on and we're in like our full uniform, and we go out to the memorial and we say, our words, and the families are there, and we lay the wreath and we take the shot. That's the point when you start to like, you finally can step back from the high up tempo of everything, and you can remember what actually, like, what are we actually fighting for? Like, who are we actually fighting for? It's those families who have lost their loved ones, those who have gone on deployments where they couldn't even tell their families where they were and they never came home. It's for those type, it's for that, being able to be in an organization where that is such a core aspect. It's unreal. There's nothing else like that out there. Like, I mean, I'm now obviously I'm out of the military. I'm a civilian, and navigating the civilian world, it's difficult, and that does not exist. That sense of community based off of loss of life, based off of family, not just your brothers who stand next to you in uniform, but also brothers and sisters, but also, the families of the loved ones who perished. That you don't see that ever. So for me, like coming onto the compound and going about the every single day, hustle and bustle, high up tempo, stress as hell about literally everything that's going on, all of the drama that's going on, taking that couple minutes to put your beret on and go stand out at the memorial and remember those who have actually made the ultimate sacrifice, I thought was one of the most important parts of being a Night Stalker. And I know that tradition is never going to die. And it needs to continue and be cherished and valued as highly as it is right now, forever and ever, because those are the people that we have to remember at all times.
Absolutely. And I think that that's probably about as well put as anybody could possibly say it. I mean, I know Spence, myself, Brett, who isn't here, and the entire team behind, the foundation. It's literally the whole reason it exists, because those pockets of places and people who do keep those memories alive are very scarce, even inside of Army aviation. It's not. I think there's a broad view that it's just like, oh well, there's the memorial out there, and they see that and they think, oh yeah, they remember all these people all the time, but that's just not true. And so,
Yeah.
I think that's I think that the way
The
you put it's
sad
very well.
the sad thing that like I always thought about like while I was on the compound every day was like there's no more buildings to name. Like we have all these names, but there's nowhere to like to place their name so that we see it every single day. And that was like something that kind of hit me pretty hard. I was like, what like I don't know, that for some reason I was just like I like to have it like very visual and to be able to remember it constantly. So yeah, unfortunately there's too many names to remember, which is heartbreaking.
Yeah. Kind of stepping back from that history piece of regiment and, six guns and six back, really the entirety of regiment for that matter. When you were going over, I know for myself and some of the things that I had looked at doing, a huge factor of appeal. Obviously I wasn't a 64 pilot, I was a 60 guy. So the reality of trying to go to B code or, to fly the AH-6 was slim to zero, for me at the time and what I had heard. But the Little Bird itself as a platform, still super appealing. It's the only place in the Army that has it. It was the closest thing to what I had originally wanted to fly, which was the Kiowa, rest in peace. And so, the platform itself is just totally different. Greg Coker, in an article a couple years ago, had a really interesting quote. For any of you who don't know who Greg Coker is, he's a retired CW4. He wrote the book Death Waits in the Dark. Go check it out. We've talked to him a little bit. He's a pretty good guy. But he mentioned it's like flying a Ferrari compared to a lot of other airframes. What I'm interested is, to kind of hear your flying experience going from, a 64, presumably Echo at the time, over to or a Delta. Either way, aircraft with aircraft with hydraulics.
Yeah.
Over to
Exactly.
flying this seemingly indestructible platform, and kind of what that experience was like for you.
Yeah. The one thing I would say is I don't know if I would consider it the Ferrari of the sky because it's not that fast of an aircraft. We actually hold the rest of the half back on, pretty much every occasion. But in terms of like fun and freeness of that aircraft, yeah, no, it flies like however you want it to. It took me a little bit of while, to get used to it, right? Because I mean, coming from the 64, it has hold modes. I mean, it can basically hover in place. It doesn't like take off and land by itself or anything, but it just, the aircraft, the hydraulics, the SAS, all the systems that are in place in the 64, it just makes it such a smooth ride. You have a flight path vector, I think we called it, that you can, with your eyepiece reticle, just put it perfectly on wherever you want to land and just fly the aircraft to it. I mean, it's almost like fail proof at that point. Flying the Little Bird is very much the opposite. I mean, even just picking the aircraft off the ground and hovering it starts to become much more natural. But the first time you do it, I mean, it was like flight school day one all over again. You know, you forget that you really need to use those pedals. They have a very, very important purpose in the little bird. You cannot let go of any of the flight controls. If you're on the flight controls, you let go like that. I mean, you are over torquing, like everything possible is going to go wrong in the aircraft. Yeah, it's not an easy aircraft to fly. It takes full attention constantly from both pilots. You know, like no one can be off at all when even in just like a routine traffic pattern type of flight. They say in aviation, like you always have to be ahead of the aircraft. You know, whatever it is, you always have to be like one step ahead of what the aircraft is going to do next. And in the little bird, like you have to definitely be ahead of that aircraft. You have to anticipate every single input that you make is going to have some sort of counter reaction, and you have to anticipate exactly like what the winds are, you know, every atmospheric condition, because it's going to affect the way that aircraft flies. Yeah, but it's fun. It's a real, like, I felt like I was actually flying. You know what I mean? It was one of those types of things where like I wanted to be a pilot, and I felt like I was actually a pilot when I was flying the little bird. You know, there were 100 things going on in the cockpit, all these radios going off. There's no moving maps. You know, like in the 64, we had these like beautiful maps that would fly us from place to place. You know, you knew exactly what was around, where the wires were, all this stuff. Like what told us where wires were in the little bird were our eyes. You know, it's a little bit of a different scenario when you're flying little bird, and you know you're flying off of waypoint to waypoint off of like a directional cue from a heading. It's slightly different, but it's challenging and it's fun because you're like really doing it. You know, the aircraft's not doing it for you. So that aspect in itself was something that I enjoyed. I liked the challenge of it, and I like the physicality of it. You know, it's brutal. It's you come down, like you land at a FARP, and like you pop out and you load your own ammo. You know what I mean? Like loading ammo cans, getting under the aircraft. Like there's just a lot of loading rockets. There's just a lot of scenarios where you're getting like just down and dirty with it. And I don't know, like for me, that was just something that was I just loved that aspect of it. You know, even like when I mean, there'd be days when we were out at range 29 and it was like, I don't know, 15 degrees outside or colder. I mean, we were bundled up, like so many layers of clothes on, and it's just like very uncomfortable to fly. It's very challenging to fly like that. But then we would still have to like have our gloves like with fingers exposed or whatever it is, so we could press all the buttons. And so like your fingers would just be frozen in like the shape of the cyclic. Like you just like couldn't, like your hand was just stuck. Like because obviously there's no doors or anything. And then there'd be days when it was 110 degrees outside and you are just completely drenched. I mean, to the point where there's like another thing too, like there's nowhere to like put water bottles in the aircraft. You know
that's
what I mean? Like,
important.
You get one water bottle.
That's important.
Yeah, you get one water bottle. If you drink that thing, like it's done. That's it. There's nowhere to like store your snacks and coolers and whatever else you need in there. Like it's basically like your packet and one water bottle and you're off. So
you know,
I don't know, but I like that.
You know what I think is wild about the platform itself is that, to your point, I mean, this wasn't 20, 30 years ago. This was much more recent. And I think that the most impressive part is that the aircraft, through its multiple decades of service, still is, you know, mission proven, reliable, does what you want it to do, regardless of the physicality, and still is, you know, very actively in use. I think that that's probably one of the most impressive parts, given that it is, you know, it is a physical aircraft to fly. No, it doesn't have all of these external things assisting us, but still the most, you know, the highest level of aviation, you know, inside of the US is still actively using the platform for missions, which I think says a lot to its durability and its capability as an airframe, and also to the pilots who learn to master it and, fly it. I can't imagine flying that over Vietnam, shining a light to draw fire for cobras to come in and take them out. That would have been a
Yeah,
horrible mission.
hunter killer
Yeah,
teams.
that would have been horrible. But I think it still says a lot to just how much, how much the aircraft can withstand. And for people who maybe don't fully grasp some of the things we're talking about, you're talking about an airframe that, I don't know. I don't know. It's max gross off the top of my head, but I do know that, you can only put a couple people on the back before you're at that, depending on fuel. But now you're talking, putting that aircraft into shooting profiles, dive recoveries with full weapons loads and gas and everything else on an aircraft that doesn't have hydraulics, but still can perform in those profiles that you're asking it to do. Physicality aside, that is insane. Which is super cool. And, again, a huge testament to everybody who's in that community and goes through and learns how to fly. And I'd probably wreck it because I don't remember how to use pedals in an aircraft. We had this awesome thing called an MMU that I didn't have to, I could literally hover and not touch the pedals at all. It would eventually
Yeah.
come back and go to the center. It was great. So, but no, that's awesome. Lindsey, kind of moving forward, I know we've probably beat up quite a bit on the special operations side of the house and that part of your career. But looking forward, what kind of made you decide, hey, I want to, kind of leave, pursue my MBA, kind of go this separate trajectory maybe from where you were, going at that time?
Yeah, it's a really good question because if you had asked me, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, I would have said, no, I'm 100% staying in. Like, the thing is like, I don't think that there was like one moment where I was like, okay, it's time to get out now. I think it was kind of like a slow realization that there are other things out there that I can pursue, and instead of taking my entire life and having that be like a flying career out of it. Like I said, I didn't get to command, and that's one thing that I would have loved to do, to have stayed in and done that. But like my timeline didn't necessarily work out for that. And if I had stayed in, then I was going to command an HHC company within the regiment. So it was just going to be a little bit different, that to me just didn't sound as exciting as being able to go back to the 64 community and work with those guys. But I guess like the real reason that I wanted to get out was I really want to have a family. And it's really hard. It's a really hard thing to do as a woman. I commend every woman that is like flying for the 160, the warrants, the female warrants that are out there, even the officers, even if they're in like a staff position. The amount of deployments and rotations and trips, it just takes you away from your family so much. And I don't know, like I'm kind of getting to the point in my life where the family is becoming a priority, and I want to have kids. And if I had gotten pregnant when I was in the 160th, obviously I can't be around aircraft. I didn't like, who knew what I was going to be able to do. And it just, I don't know. It didn't really sound very enticing and especially because I kind of want to have like at least 3 kids, 2 or 3. I mean, that's like years of not doing what I love to do, which would be flying, or even it would just be a very, very different type of world. So that was like my primary reason why I was like, okay, there's other opportunities out here. I'm at the right time in my career. I'm pre-ILE. So I don't have any extra commitments. I'm at my ETS date. I can actually, make this decision and get out and pursue my MBA, which is what I inevitably ended up doing. And the MBA, I really love school. I don't know. It's like my thing. I just really love being in a classroom and learning new things. And I didn't really want to get just like thrown out into the business world without having any experience. I'm also kind of the person that just like wants a little bit, like, I want to get my feet wet before I like dive into something. So I figured, going to get my MBA was probably the best bet for me as like developing myself in my business career. And plus I had zero business acumen. I didn't know what a P&L was. You know what I mean? Like there's just like so much that goes on in the business world that I was had no idea even existed. So I figured I probably should take a little bit of time, step away from, a job or anything, and just immerse myself in as much learning as I possibly can do before I throw a resume in to get a job. So that's really the reason why I wanted to go get my MBA. Yeah, and I got pretty lucky getting into school. So
Yeah, that's
yeah.
awesome. I would say Harvard is a pretty big accomplishment for anybody just getting accepted, let alone, doing well there. But on that way, you started your own business, correct?
I did. Yeah. My home, shout out there. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of opportunities, when you're at Harvard and there's recruiters that are there, for all these huge firms, McKinsey and investment banking and private equity and all these like very important figureheads that are coming through and trying to like beg for your resume. And I just didn't want to work for anybody else. I didn't want to work for anyone else, and I wanted to build a team and build a culture that like and kind of like replicate what I loved about the military in my own company. So those are like kind of like the reasons why I decided to go down the entrepreneurship route. And eventually we stumbled upon the idea of basically digitizing home services. So just like a little like caveat as to what my home actually is. It's essentially an all-in-one platform for homeowners to not only like schedule home service vendors, like think like HVAC, electric, plumbing, housekeeping, lawn care, pest control, but within the platform itself, also you get to pay your vendors, rebook with them, communicate with them. Like it's an all-in-one type of platform. It's very different than, I mean, you could think of like what Angie's is out there, where you're answering 40 different questions and they're just pushing all of your information out to like 40 different vendors, and you may get a quote, you might just get bombarded with a ton of marketing emails. So we're basically closing that entire loop and keeping it all in-house. It's just a lot simpler for homeowners in general.
Did you go through a personal pain point that inspired you to start that? Or can you talk a little bit about the evolution of why this was the route you decided to go in terms of starting a company?
Yeah. So we had this idea originally where like the pain point essentially was, so I'm a homeowner, actually own two homes in Clarksville and in Nashville, and we long-term rent the home in Clarksville. And the maintenance it's just so inconvenient. There's really no way to manage multiple properties as just a homeowner without, hiring some sort of like property management company, and then they take 3%. It's expensive. And so I was like, how can there be like an all-in-one service for homeowners? And it doesn't have to necessarily be like homeowners of multiple properties. It could just be of one property, managing, your housekeeping and your pest control and your lawn care within itself is a hassle, because you're Venmoing your housekeeper, you're leaving a check in the mailbox for the lawn care guy, like your credit card's going out to the pest control, and you're communicating in all different ways. It's just a mess. It's a fragmented ecosystem. And so we had this original idea where we were going to like create this all-in-one company that would come to your home in like one truck and would do like your HVAC, your housekeeping, and your pest control all at one time within one company. But what we realized with that was it's incredibly expensive. It's capital intensive to start that, because you have to buy all the equipment, you have to hire all the people, train them, etc. And it's not really it's not scalable. It's a very, very difficult model to scale. So we're like, how can we kind of take that initial idea and roll that into like a tech platform? And that's kind of how my home was born, through, I mean, I'd probably like to say about 6 months of ideation on the initial idea of like an all-in-one home service platform, where we finally came up to the solution of just digitizing home services, consolidating that fragmented ecosystem where it's an all-in-one platform for homeowners to match with vendors. And we're actually launching this summer.
Awesome.
So we'll have a product here in Nashville. Yeah. So Nick, I'll definitely need you to
Awesome.
download
Yeah.
my home once we go live. Yeah.
Are you, I have so many questions. Are you technical? Did you build it, or how did you solve that problem if you're not?
Yeah. No, I have no technical background. I can't code a single thing. I had one class in Harvard on coding, and it was God near impossible. And so I very early on recognized that fact, and we actually hired a CTO full time. He's absolutely incredible. His name's Joel, and he has over 15 years of software development experience. He used to work for L3Harris. He worked for the Tennessee Titans.
Oh,
I mean, this
nice.
guy has such an impressive background. Yeah, and the fact that he quit his full-time job and now works with my home full-time 100% is, I mean, it's incredible. Yeah, we have a really solid team.
Cool.
Kind of, wrapping things up, something that we always ask every guest that we've had on to the show so far is, usually for a piece of advice, whether that's for the next generation or for something specific. And I've been sitting here thinking about there's so many different ways that we could go with yours, but I think that probably the best way to phrase it would be, if you had to give one piece of advice, and not just for women, but for anybody going into, I would say, a profession where they feel as though they may have imposter syndrome, where they're even looking to go or in that process, what would your piece of advice for them to be and overcoming that and still pursuing it anyway? I say that because I think a lot of people, they're their own worst enemy, and they hold themselves back from pursuing things that they may be qualified and they may be
Yeah.
100% able to go do, but they feel like, oh, I can't do that. That's way out of my reach.
Yeah. I think a couple small tidbits of advice on that piece. One is to remain humble in those instances. I think allows you to stand out above others, because I think a lot of people nowadays think that the way to impress someone is through like a ton of knowledge, just stay like being loud, being like maybe a little overly aggressive, exuding tons of confidence. But yet sometimes what I'm finding is the people who are the silent professionals are the ones that stand out the most, and can be trusted the most, and usually have like the best head on their shoulders. So I would say kind of going into whatever situation it is with a sense of humility and a sense of like not reserved, like being reserved, but just understanding that your time is going to come. Your time to shine doesn't necessarily need to be every single instance you're in front of these people. It could be in one instance, and that's when your time to shine is, and that's going to stand out way more if you wait for that moment than if you just come in like hardcore, headstrong, like right from the start. So I guess that would be like my first piece of advice. My second is, one thing that I like to do is I like to, and this isn't like my idea, I don't even know who I stole it from, but like do one really hard thing every single day. So like no matter what it, like find something in your day that you don't want to do and just do it, and do it every single day so that it becomes a habit to do hard things. Like for example, my husband and I bought a cold plunge. I know this is kind of like a cliche example, but getting into a cold plunge, a 39-degree cold plunge every single morning, before you go to the gym. Like this morning we woke up at 5:30 and it's 5:45 and I'm outside getting in this freaking cold plunge and it's absolutely freezing and it hurt, like it's not fun. You know what I mean? But then as soon as you get out, like your day is just instantaneously better. You know why? Because like you woke up early and you got in that freaking cold plunge, and then you're just, whatever is to come in the rest of the day, it's like, all right, it's probably not going to be as hard as putting my body in 39 degrees for 2 minutes. So like that's just like a small example, but I mean there's a ton of different things that people can do that is just challenging for them, whether it's, I don't know, dedicate yourself to reading 10 pages of a book before you fall asleep without actually falling asleep, like read that 10 pages, do one thing that is going to like make you better, but also is a challenge for you. And I think that is going to like just like help build your confidence over time. And then when you're in those situations where, you might not feel the most confident, or you might feel very intimidated, and that imposter syndrome is real, you in the back of your head have that little bit of information where you're like, guess what I did? I could do this because I've been doing X, Y, and Z. and just those like little pieces of challenges that you're putting into your life, I think can really go a long way.
We either try to battle that, whatever that imposter syndrome is with either way too much fake confidence or not enough confidence. And so I think that those tools are fantastic for people to build those skills necessary to make their goals a reality. So Spencer, do you have anything else?
I have so many questions, but I want to be respectful of your time, Lindsey, because I know we've already pushing about an hour and a half. So I would like to open up the floor for you to share with our guests, like how they can find out more about what you're doing with My Home. If you guys are on social media, if is the name of the app My Home? Are you planning on launching native, or is it going to be a web app? Like, educate our listeners so they can kind of figure out how they can support you if they're interested, or more importantly, probably solve all the problems that you're working on fixing for all the homeowners.
Yeah, no, I mean, we are launching our social media campaign June 1st, and we will be on every social media platform that's out there. TikTok, I don't even have TikTok. Wasn't even allowed to have TikTok when I was in the 160th. I got to do TikToks now. Yeah, so it's most of the platforms are going to be like on the socials are going to be my home underscore platform. I can send you guys links and everything in my email signature blocks. I have links to all the socials and everything, and then the website is myhomeservices.io. My LinkedIn links to it as well. So if anyone, Lindsey Chrismon on LinkedIn, that'll link to the My Home platform. But yeah, I mean, it's exciting stuff. Honestly, it's very intimidating starting your own company, but there's no way that I'd be able to do any of these types of things if it wasn't for the team that's working on My Home. And yeah, it's fun. Well, we want to change the entire home services industry. I mean, the goal is for My Home to be in the hands of every single homeowner across the United States. Like it will be the new thing for homeowners to maintain their properties.
Awesome.
Lindsey, we want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story from little birds all the way over to your entrepreneurial side with My Home. It's all very exciting. And we also want to say a huge thank you to MD Helicopters, who has worked with us to make this entire process possible. And unfortunately, like I said, they couldn't be here today, but we are super excited to collaborate with them on behalf of the Brotallion Blue Skies Foundation. So again, if you're interested in supporting that collaborative effort to raise money for the foundation, head over to the Brotallion Blue Skies Foundation.org, where you can show support for this episode by supporting the foundation.